Shalom. I want to start off by giving all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Bahashum, Rachak Kodash. I want to give double honors to our apostles and the elders of Great Millstone who rule well, and grace and peace to you elect around the four winds, believing and pushing this truth in all sincerity. May the blessing of election be upon your houses. This is your fellow servant, Rakhaya from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another impromptu lesson. And I was just sitting here watching the Elder Yashawamba's recent video. It's recent in the news, and it's entitled, "They Are Destroying the Earth." All right. And as you can see, I'm about 16 minutes in, and the Elder is getting into this new world ScrewWorm fiasco that's reared its head over there in Texas and is bound to spread throughout the United States. This is bound to spread throughout Babylon as a whole. But I wanted to get into this brief lesson through the Spirit on how much of an impact this is going to have, not only on the economy, but on the average Negro, Latino, and Native American Indian household. All right, because the scriptures foretold of a time of Jacob's trouble, which we're going to get. All right, the scriptures foretold of a time when the house of Jacob, which is consistent of you so-called Negroes, you so-called Latinos, and you so-called Native American Indians, will be in a state of trouble. All right, and now we're entering into that time period very swiftly. All right, the judgment is getting ready to get a whole lot more personal for you people. We're no longer in the time where you're able to turn off the news outlets and go back to focusing on your different luxuries and amenities. All right, those luxuries and amenities are coming to an abrupt end. And the economy as we know it, the world as we know it, is being reshaped and reformed by the wicked. There's more of a strain. This serpent is starting to put more of a chokehold on the society, on the economy, all right, on society, and in the world in general. All right, and now we're coming into that time period where the judgment will be felt, and it's no longer escapable. This is a near future, all right? This is Jeremiah 30:7. It says, "Alas, for that day is great, so that none is like it. It is even the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it." All right, now he that shall be saved out of the time of Jacob's trouble is speaking about the elect. All right, those who receive that that mark of exemption, spoken about in Ezekiel, the 9th chapter and the 4th verse. All right, those who have been sighing and crying for the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. Basically those who have been fighting, to the best of their ability, to the best of their spirit, against this world and against the image of the beast, and ultimately the mark, through the Spirit. But we're coming into that time of Jacob's trouble, which we're already in it. But that time, the troubling times, are becoming more and more frequent and more unescapable. And for you Negroes, Latinos, and Native American Indians, there's a time coming very swiftly, all right, to where the judgment is getting ready to get a whole lot more personal. All right, your households will feel the judgment of Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Shai. Let's check it out.
Book are faithful and true. Okay.
The grocery store, National News Desk, Satra Elnashar joining us live from Capitol Hill with the latest on this. This is not good.
It's gross, it's dangerous, it's a nightmare for ranchers and farmers. So it's called New World ScrewWorm. Technically, it's a parasitic fly, but its maggots feed on the tissue or flesh of warm-blooded animals.
And all of the food that we eat is plagued with parasites.
Hey, and I want to get this as well. Even though the Elder Yashawamba brought it out in his lesson, I want to get it here as well. Because the Lord prophesied, all right, or foretold, that he will bring the same plagues as in ancient Egypt. All right, this is 2nd Esdras 15. And I'm going to start at verse 11. I'm going to start at verse 10. Behold, my people is led as a flock to the slaughter. I will not suffer them now to dwell in the land of Egypt, which America is the modern day Egypt, spiritual Egypt. It says, but I will bring them with a mighty hand and a stretched out arm, and smite Egypt with plagues as before, and I will destroy all the land thereof. And the elder was getting into the murrain, that plagued ancient Egypt, which is the same thing that's happening today. But the Lord said he would smite Egypt again, with the plagues thereof. He said, Egypt shall mourn, and the foundation of it shall be smitten with the plague and punishment that the Heavenly Father shall bring upon it. They that till the ground shall mourn, for their seed shall fail through the blasting and hail, and with the fearful constellation. And this is important because the tillers of the ground, the farmers, all right, are an essential part to a nation's economy. All right, if you have no farmers, you don't have an economy, because the farmers are responsible for the food, for the nation's fuel in a sense. We're fueled by food, So the farmers are in charge of a huge part of the economy. So with the blasting and hail and these farmers being put in the predicament that they're being put in now, they're being shunned, they're being phased out of society. A lot of their crops are dying now because of the turbulent weathers. Now we have this new world screwworm, all right, that is plaguing these different farms and cattle. All right, this is going to have a huge impact on the economy, on society as a whole, which we're gonna hear it in the video. Let's play it.
The powers that be make sure of that, and that is the number one forwarder of sickness, cancer. All of these things are linked to parasites. Okay, so this man just has created a mess. Okay, and he ain't gonna stop.
And sometimes people too. As of now, the USDA is reporting 6 active cases, 4 cattle and a goat in Texas, and a dog in New Mexico. All of this detected in the past week, and they update their numbers every day at noon Eastern. Now, because screwworms don't spread through meat or dairy products, officials stress for consumers this is not a food safety issue, it's a food production issue, and it's coming at the worst possible time. U.S. cattle inventory is at a 75-year low per the USDA, and in the past year, we don't have to tell folks at home, they know this at the grocery store, beef prices have just skyrocketed, up almost.
And they're going to use these as reasons to, uptick the prices in foods. All right, it's going to lead to perplexity. All right, and everything that we've been talking about is happening. But as you can see, the poly crisis continues.
Right, and this is just another phase of the poly crisis. Which, like the elder stated in the video, like the news, the anchor woman stated in the video, beef prices and prices of meat in general are going to continue to rise, and as a result of this new onset of screwworm disease, or whatever you want to call it, is going to cause those prices to rise even more. Which I wanted to get into this, right? How's everybody? There's a guy named Tone Talks, the hall you put me on him a couple of years back, and he's a guy, he's a jig that likes to get into the numbers surrounding really painting a picture on the hole that has been dug economically for the Negro, Latino, Native American, Indian. Mainly he speaks about, the Southern Kingdom. But that hole is present for each and every one of the tribes. He likes to get into the numbers, of how down bad Jake is, to put it in simple terms, but I want to get this as well here, because as she said, the produce or meat prices are going to continue to skyrocket. And when you look up on Google what the average income for a black household is, it says the average income for a black household in the U.S. is approximately $83,000 and $83,000. It says with a median income of $56,000. All right, which these numbers are could be lower than what they show. But nonetheless, it says that the average income for a black household in the United States is $83,000, and the median income is $56,000. Now, when you type into Google, all right, how much does it cost to sustain a household of four in the U.S.? It says sustaining a family of four in the U.S. requires an average of $106,000 to $110,000 annually. So it basically costs six figures on average, to sustain a household of four in Babylon today. In which we just read that the the average income for a so-called Negro household is $86,000 or $83,000. So that's already more than $20,000, less than what it takes to so-called sustain a household of four in Babylon. So we add the rising cost of the produce of food, of healthcare and so on and so forth. All right, Jake isn't going to be able to afford these different things. To put it simply, without going into any elaborate, message, Jake isn't going to be able to afford what's getting ready to happen to the economy. What Esau is getting ready to do is getting ready to shock the average household of the so-called Negro, Latino, and Native American Indian in a way that's going to be unrecuperable without receiving his mark. He's going to put the people in a position to where the mark is the only other outlet. And now we're starting to see the onset of that positioning of what this devil is getting ready to do. He's getting ready to engineer a famine. All right, which is we're in the process of that. All right, which the scriptures foretold. The scriptures foretold this was going to happen: a famine of the word and a famine of bread and water. Was prophesied to happen in the latter days, and now we're living in the beginning stages of that. The beginning stages of famine, beginning stages of the resources being hoarded within the hands of few. All right. And those resources that are desired, having a stipulation put on them. All right, which that stipulation ultimately at the end of the day is going to be the mark of the beast. But this is 2 16 and verse 18. It says, the beginning of sorrows and great mournings, the beginning of famine and great death, the beginning of wars, and the power shall stand in fear, the beginning of evils. What shall I do when these evils shall come? Behold, famine and plague, tribulation and anguish are sent as scourges for a minute. But for all these things they shall not turn from their wickedness, nor be always mindful of the scourges. Behold, victuals shall be so good cheap upon the earth that they shall think themselves to be in good case. And even then shall evils grow upon the earth, sword, famine, and great confusion. Whilst we had a time where victuals were so good cheap upon the earth, which is about 4 to 5, maybe 6 years ago. All right, now times have changed. All right, now even fast food stores are hiking up their prices. Now you can no longer go to Wendy's and get a 4 for $4. That shit gonna cost you around $8, $9, maybe $10, man. And that's the case around Babylon the Great as a whole. Victuals are no longer so good cheap. The evils that were being worked and performed in the background are not being brought to the forefront. And now it's starting to have an effect on everyone. Everyone is starting to feel the squeeze. And the squeeze is getting tighter and tighter and tighter for these people, man. To where eventually they're going to crash out. Eventually we're going to come to that point spoken about in 2 Esdras, the 15th chapter, of sedition, a concerted attempt to overthrow civil authority. Eventually, it's going to reach that point in society when these people's stomachs are touching their back, because the scriptures say that the majority of people are going to die by famine. They should. Let me see. All right, it's the 2 Esdras 16 and 22. One more verse down. For many of them that dwell upon the earth shall perish of famine, and the other that escape the hunger shall the sword destroy. All right, so also while famine is being prepared, the sword also is being prepared for those who escape the hunger. And the scriptures say that many of them shall perish of famine. All right, lots of bodies are getting ready to drop in these up and coming weeks, months, years. All right, Lord willing, it's next year. But a lot of bodies are getting ready to drop due to the famine that's being engineered through the Spirit. And the prophets forewarned, gave you ample warning through the Spirit and power of Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Ample warning. Day in and day out, week in and week out, warning after warning. And now we're coming to that point to where the warning is a reality. Esau is making life itself unaffordable. The principal things for the use of man's life: water, oil, flour, wheat, the blood of the grape, iron, fire, salt. All of these bare necessities are being controlled and made unaffordable by the devil, man. By the so-called white man, by the fucking devil. That squeeze is getting tighter. And eventually it's going to reach a point to where this famine is full blown. And the scriptures say in the book of Lamentations how it's better to die by the sword than it is by famine. Because when you die by famine, it's a slow, painful death. Your body starts to eat away at itself. And that's a slow process. It takes weeks for famine to set in, for your body to start eating on the fats that have been stored up, to start eating on the different tissue and vein. It takes weeks for that to happen. This is the time that we're coming into. This is the time that the Lord warned us about. All right, this is the time that the Lord told us to prepare for, mentally, spiritually. All right, because this time is close. It's close. And it's not going to be too much longer. That is just words on the page. Eventually, just like the rest of the prophecies, is going to manifest. So with that being said, now's the time to lock in with the Lord, man. Lock in with Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Stay present in the moment. Continue to grow. And look forward to what the Lord has next. Continue to trust in the Lord and look forward to what the Lord has next. Because for us of the household of faith, for us of the hopefully elect, things are only going to get better for us here on out. All right, as this world is destroyed, we understand that the world to come is being prepared for those who believe and trust in Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. And whether in life or death, the victory will come to the elect and Yahweh Shai at the end of the day. That's a fact. But I just want to get into that brief lesson, man. I'm not even gonna play this video. This is a good guy to listen to, man. Just if you want to, get into the numbers, of how down bad Jake is financially and economically. This is a good watch, to show you how much of a stupor our people are in, with all these distractions right before them, these rappers, these NBA players, giving them this false sense of wealth and security. Behind the scenes, shit is getting rough for the average Negro, Latino, Native American Indian household. Times are hard. The bills are getting higher, more and more expensive. Food is getting more and more expensive. To take care of children is getting more and more expensive. Utilities are getting more and more expensive. Also, while the same job opportunities are present, there's hardly any growth within these so-called jobs that we have today. There's hardly any growth in income. And there's hardly any opportunity to get ahead of the bills that are present, of the payments that we're subject to under the rule and scrutiny of Esau Edom. So the squeeze is felt. Times are hard, man, and they're gonna get harder before the elect, man. These times are going to get beautiful, more and more beautiful, because this is where the Lord's mercy is going to shine as well, just as bright as the Lord's judgment. But with that being said, the point was made. Lord is edifying unto you elect, and give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashum, Yahweh Shai, Bahashum, Rakakwadash, and double honors to our apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well. Grace and peace to you elect. Shalom.